Hi guys, Derek here again. So we will talk about kernel versus OS, operating systems. So kernel, what does kernel mean? Kernel is like, to give you an analogy, it's basically the engine. Like it's a privileged core that like talks to the hardware. So kernel is actually a subset of the OS. So OS here and then kernel here. So OS here is basically, to extend an analogy, is like the whole car. So basically the engine, the drivers, the system, library, services, UI, or engine here meaning like the kernel here. Drivers are basically like programs that interact with the OS, I think, if I understand it correctly. So just to give you like a brief like laundry list of why they're similar but also different, or actually different. So kernel here, the scope is like minimum core running in kernel privilege mode, while the operating system here is the kernel versus the user space libraries, daemons, shell, GUI, everything basically. So like OS is like there's the hardware and then there's the OS and then there's like software. So basically OS like lets the software talk with the hardware. So and kernel is like the main engine of that. So the main job here would be like the resource management and protection, scheduling, memory management, system calls. So here the operating system basically like completes user and runtime environment. Yeah, so there's an E right here. Anyway, for the interface, the way to interact with the kernel is like using a system called APIs. API is basically a set of software that lets you like talk with a different software, but like you're only exposed to like the abstract cores. For example, like if you go to a restaurant, you go to see like a menu and then you can only see certain types, but you don't know how how the dish is made, right? For example, like a spaghetti or like, a dish. So basically like a read or fork, like these functions are like how we interact with the kernel basically. But we're the technicalities, the details are abstracted away. So that's like what an API is, and then what a system call API is. Read, fork, etc. I think like the professor and the textbook and the slides will like explain these later, or eventually if they have it. And then the operating system, the interface is the user facing APIs and tools like libc, shells, CLI, command line interface. The kernel lives in the kernel space, and then the OS lives in the kernel space and the user space. So note that like we said, the OS is like a superset of OS, a superset of kernel. So kernel contains the OS, yeah. So an example would be a Linux kernel. An example of OS would be Ubuntu, Windows, Mac OS. Variants are like monolithic, microkernel, and hybrid. I think the textbook explains these differences. Feel free to read them. Yeah, I think like different people implement it differently, and they all have their like trade-offs. What's like good and bad, and generally in engineering, there's always a trade-off. Yeah, so that's pretty much it. I hope this video helps you. If you have any question, comments, or feedback, please let me know. I'm happy to improve. Thank you.